Y'all better hide your wife, hide your kids, and hide your husband, because death's coming for everybody out here. What is up, guys, and welcome to the culmination, at least for now, of the Final Destination review series, and we're at the brand new film, Final Destination Bloodlines, the 6th film in the long-running franchise. It's crazy to think that it has been 14 years since our last Final Destination movie, because these sequels were cranked out fairly consistently, and then even with the 5th film having pretty good reviews, having a pretty good box office return, it's been a long break. And I don't know how much of that had to do with just the change in culture as far as horror and what horror audiences are paying for. How much of that is just writers really racking their minds trying to figure out how to do something different with this franchise. But we finally got one, and there's been a lot of hype and excitement behind this one. It's gotten outstanding reviews. I think it's sitting at like a 94 or a 95 on Rotten Tomatoes, light years past whatever the second place film is as far as critical ratings. So I have been very curious what this thing was going to turn out to be. I have been a fan of this franchise since day one, save for the 4th film, of course, and I am ready for some Final Destination carnage. Now, all of these movies, save for the 4th one, are pretty consistent as far as the quality, as far as what they give you, as far as how well they execute what they give you, no pun intended. And this is a film franchise that, for the most part, us horror fans go to for the kill scenes. Of course, if we can get some great characters, if we can get a little bit of story, a little bit of added lore, a nice Tony Todd appearance, that's just icing on the cake, but we come here for the death scenes. But after having watched through all 5 films over the last week or so, my hopes for this movie, not necessarily my expectations, but my hopes were that we would get some more of those extra things. We would get a little bit of a reinvention. We would get a little bit added to the lore. Maybe they'll change up the template and the dynamic of these films that we've pretty much been sticking to a T for the last 5 films. And so I did have expectations that maybe this film would finally give a little bit of new life, but at bare minimum, if they just gave us a templated Final Destination experience and executed it well, I'd be happy. And the premise of this film actually is slightly different from the other 5 that pretty much sounded exactly the same as I was reading them off in my reviews. In this one, you have a woman who is in college who suddenly is plagued by this horrific nightmare every single night that turns out to be the premonition that her grandmother had 50 years previous. And because her grandmother dodged death 50 years ago, the entire bloodline of their family was never meant to be. So death is coming back for that entire family one by one. And starting off with the positives for Final Destination Bloodlines, I really liked that slightly new direction that this movie took. Now, I don't think that they completely reinvented the wheel. It's still, at its heart, a very templated Final Destination movie, but I did appreciate that they tried to do something a little unique to give a slightly different flavor to how death works, how death's plan is going to be enacted, and as well as the dynamic of the characters that we're going to be following. I think it's a really interesting thing to explore one person that had a premonition that didn't just get a dozen or so people out of there before the tragedy befell everyone else. They actually managed to stop that tragedy. And so hundreds of people all got away from death's design, and all of the people that they inevitably gave birth to and that those people gave birth to are all people that were not ever a part of death's original design. And so you see a much more expanded and a much more grand scale look at death trying to clean up the mistakes of this, what this premonition has had ripple effects in its initial plan. So again, same type of deal, death coming back for somebody one by one, and they're going to come at them in nasty, horrific ways, but a little bit different and a little bit more grand scale. And what I really appreciated about that was that I never watched any of the trailers to this film, so I had no idea about the basic premise. I had no idea about this being a modern film versus the premonition being in the 50s. So when the movie started and I realized that this was taking place like in the 50s or 60s, I was like, oh, we're doing like a period piece Final Destination movie? That's fucking cool. All right, I'm on board for this. And then very quickly in the first 3 minutes of the film, when you find out that the lead character of the premonition is pregnant, I started thinking about the title Bloodlines, and I'm like, oh, is this just going to be a regular Final Destination movie in the 50s, and we're going to find out that this is like Alex's grandmother or something? That's fucking stupid. And it wasn't that, luckily. It wasn't that at all. Again, one of the many reasons why I always tell you guys, if you are sold on a movie, don't bother with the trailers, because walking in blind, more times than not, is a very rewarding experience. And so I had a really good time with having this period piece premonition, and suddenly we're following a girl in college, and it was just a nightmare, and I'm like, oh, I'm like thrown by a loop. I don't know what's going on there. I don't know what to expect from a Final Destination movie. Fucking finally. And a byproduct of the fact that we're focusing on an entire family being our cast of characters that are ill-fated here is that I do think inherently you care about and you like the characters a little bit more. It's not just a group of strangers or a group of classmates that are brought together that don't really care much for each other. There's always the skeptic, there's always the jock, there's always the bitchy girl. Like, we've had so many templated caricatures in this franchise that having a tight-knit family, brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, moms, and dads, that are all trying to navigate this situation together, it changes the dynamic a little bit, and you invest yourself a little bit more in how these characters care for each other, how they're trying to protect each other, and you do genuinely start to like them, and even though you want to see them get taken out in nasty, carnage-filled ways, part of you is kind of like, oh man, it's his time. I like that character. Oh well, fuck him up. And before I get too far away from talking about the opening of this film and the kickoff, I really dug the opening premonition sequence. I think it's easily one of the better ones of this franchise. I would not argue with anybody that said it's the best of the franchise. And I like the fact that it's just like the concept, a little bit more grand scale than some of the earlier films. I think that even though there's CGI at play, it's very wicked, it's very tension-filled, seeing all the little tiny details that have to add up and go wrong at the same time to cause this massive scale accident, and the variety of deaths that you get just in this opening premonition was pretty wicked. So I loved the way that the movie kicked off, and even having that period piece kind of aesthetic to it, I think brought a little something different there that I enjoyed. So one of the better openings of the franchise for sure. Bloodlines also carries on the more humorous direction that these films took after the second film, and I think this is arguably the funniest of all of them. There were at least 3 or 4 different lines here, all delivered by the same character who I'm going to talk about specifically, that I genuinely laughed out loud. I don't think they go too far with it. I don't think it's slapstick. I don't think it descends into like parody or anything like that where it would start to take away from all the other elements of a Final Destination film. It was just really good situational humor and more so just character interactions, natural humor that would come out with family drama and things like that. So I really had a good time with the humorous direction that this movie took. And I think for a lot of people, it's going to be one of the highlights here. Even if you like your Final Destination movies more serious like the first one, I think that they did a great job with the writing here. And that's all thanks to the character, Eric. He's the character that has all the piercings. I guess he was featured prominently in the first teaser. So you guys, if you watch the trailers, you know who I'm talking about. He might be my favorite character in this entire franchise. And what was cool about it was the first act or so of the film, I was like, oh, so this is just going to be the skeptic character. He's going to be the guy that says all the wrong things and does the dumbest shit and gets people killed or gets himself killed. We've seen this character 7 different times in this franchise. And very quickly, he turned into the most endearing one of the entire family, had the best lines, some genuinely good one-liners there. And there's a whole segment of the movie where he's trying to protect his brother. He's trying to save his brother who's next on death's list that I actually got invested in. It's not like an overly sentimental subplot, but for the bit of the movie where they're focusing on that, I was like, I like this. You know, I have close relationships with my siblings, and I'm glad we're exploring that here, because most of the other groups of characters, with the exception of the lead or co-leads trying to warn everybody, they're all just off doing their own thing. They don't care about each other. But of course, the most important piece of the recipe of a Final Destination film is the kills. The kill sequences, the gore, the carnage candy. And this, I think, is going to be the biggest point that we're going to see divisive reactions with. And mostly it's because this movie carries on the trend that has been going on in this franchise since the third film, and that's CGI gore and CGI blood. Now, more than half of this franchise has been this way, so for me, I just kind of walked in expecting it, and so the fact that we got a lot of CGI gore in this film didn't necessarily bother me or disappoint me, so I'm having the kills in my positive column because I do think there are a number of really good kills. They're very gnarly, arguably some of the gnarliest of the entire franchise, and I think that one in particular is my favorite kill of this entire franchise. I'm going to decide on that whenever I eventually rank all the kills here in about a week, but I'm pretty certain that one's going to rank in either the top 2 or crowned as number 1. And to me, that's a huge positive. You have a lot of kills here that are kind of quick and sudden, and so you get a little bit of that jolt reaction where you uncomfortably laugh, which I have a good time with. And then you have others that are the more expanded, Rube Goldberg type experiences that I really enjoy, where you see a lot of tension build up and different things setting up, little shots of a coin or a shot of a button getting pressed down or a cord being tightened, and you're just wondering how this is all going to work together and what's eventually going to be the moment where it all snaps and how is this person going to die. I love that. That's the whole signature kill style of this franchise, and I think this movie carries that legacy on well. But if you're somebody that does not like CGI gore and you despise it and it takes you out of the movie every single time, that might be an issue for you. But as I said, that's kind of the trend we've been going on. Only the first two movies to me ever really stuck to having more practical gore. At this point, I just expect the kills to look like this. And even staying on that point, I don't think that the CGI blood and gore that we have here is bad looking. You know, we've had really bad looking gore in the fourth film. I think they stepped it up incredibly with the fifth film. And I would say this one is on par, if not a little bit better than how the gore in the fifth film looked. So walk in knowing that, walk in having that expectation, and hopefully you still are able to enjoy the centerpiece of these films, which is the Carnage Candy. And the last thing that I will say here to end my positives is that I absolutely loved the scene with Tony Todd for many different reasons.
So, which one of you is next?
Now, if you have followed along with my review series, I have had some critiques and some issues with the way that they have utilized him in these films. I think he's an incredible presence. I think he's a big piece of the DNA, and the films that don't have him in it certainly suffer for it. But I've never thought that the way that they incorporate him into the story has ever felt truly organic. It feels like it's just Tony Todd, and if you took Tony Todd out of it, we would all call that character out as being weird and out of place. But this film, without giving too much of an explanation to where it would be silly, gives you just enough of an origin of his character, just enough of an explanation and some context into why he was in the place that he was, why he had the knowledge that he had, why he was actually trying to give this explanation to all these different characters throughout this franchise. I thought it was a really well done explanation. I think it made logical sense. I think that it actually improves my thoughts on his involvement in some of the previous sequels. And it gives you just enough there where you feel a little bit of closure with his character. But even more importantly, and even certainly more emotionally, it's very much kind of a goodbye and a bit of a closure for us as Tony Todd fans. I think it's pretty obvious that when they were shooting this, they knew that he was sick. I don't know if they had any idea how long he had, but they definitely incorporated a little bit of self-awareness into his scene and into his dialogue, that this was possibly going to be his last on-screen performance. And so the dialogue that he's given as far as his character's fate in the film is kind of a double meaning. It means what it means to the character of Bloodworth in the Final Destination franchise, but it also means the same and even more potently to those of us that are Tony Todd fans. And so I don't think there's going to be a dry eye in the theater if you love that man and love that man's work. And so I thought that that was an incredibly well done thing where they were able to achieve both without compromising the other. You give the character a good amount of closure and explanation, and you give us as fans a little bit of closure and a very emotional goodbye from Tony Todd. So yeah, if you're a fan, I'm joking up right now. If you're a fan, it's a very emotional scene that you don't often experience in a movie like this. That was definitely a high point for me.
Good luck.
Moving on to the mixed, while I definitely appreciated the fact that this movie makes attempts to kind of change up the formula a little bit, I do wish they added more to the actual lore of how death works. I wish it wasn't just an expansion of what we already have learned. You know, we had some different rules at least attempted to be brought in with Final Destination 2 and then Final Destination 5, and I feel like we're at a point now in this franchise where we kind of know what to expect. And I want to have something new brought into the mix. I want to have something new to give at least the characters a little bit more hope and a little bit more of a different path to try to outsmart death or try to fumble death's plan. And we don't really get a whole lot of that here. We just focus on a family rather than a group of strangers. And so just me greedily as somebody that likes lore, likes story, and I have wanted this franchise to kind of have a little bit more ambition in that regard, especially while rewatching them over the last week or so. I don't think this sixth film makes the strongest attempt at doing that, but this is obviously going to be a success. We're obviously going to get a Final Destination 7 here within the next 2 years. hopefully by the 7th film, we start to have some genuine new stuff to talk about in regard to Death's plan. The last thing that I'll say here, which was not necessarily a negative for me, but I think is an incredibly valid observation that you're going to hear a lot of people say. For the most part, this is another Final Destination movie. Now, for a lot of people, that's going to be a positive. They want things to be exactly how they remember. They want to follow the template. They want to know exactly what they're walking into. And as long as you deliver that, you have got them very much happy by the end of the film. But for a number of people that have a little bit more expectations, or maybe aren't as married to the nostalgia of the earlier films, or just not as big of a fan of the franchise as a whole, we'll walk out and say this feels like the second one and the third one and the fifth one. And I don't think that that's an invalid thing to say. So another thing like the gore that I think is going to be a bit of a divisive element is that despite a number of things that they do try to bring some new flavor into here, it's still at its heart a very templated Final Destination movie. So it's going to depend on you whether or not that's a positive or a negative. Now moving on to the negatives, and we're going to start small, work our way to the bigger issues. One thing, kind of piggybacking off of what I was just talking about as far as the lore and the rules of death, this franchise has always kind of played a little bit loose with how strongly it holds to those rules, for as serious as it wants our characters in these films to take these rules as if they are ironclad, they've always kind of played a little bit coy with the logic of how things work. And I think they do the same thing here, where you'll have something introduced and then later on something will happen that seems to kind of contradict that. Sometimes it feels almost borderline plot hole-ish. Sometimes it just feels like this franchise is basically telling us, like, don't take this shit too seriously. We're just trying to have fun and kill people. But if we're trying to have that be the attitude of a Final Destination film, I think they need to kind of convey that a little bit better with all the exposition and all of the storyline in regard to the characters spending so much screen time trying to hammer out what the rules actually are. So movie plays a little bit coy with its logic and with the rules of its universe. There's also a number of things in here that require our characters to be incredibly stupid in order to make the plot work. Again, something you kind of expect, and most of us just embrace as a part of the DNA of a slasher film or a film like this that's more supernatural, but focusing on the death sequences. You have to have characters behave stupid, otherwise they would all survive. I understand that, but there is a point where sometimes they behave abnormally dumb. When they know that death's after them, when they know what the rules are, when they know that they're next, and they still put themselves in situations where they have death all around them, it just starts to strain a little bit of credibility if you take any of this seriously. And even like one part where you have the grandmother that I was talking about earlier, who's kind of the one who started this entire death legacy of this bloodline chapter. And they go off to meet her at one point, and it's like Laurie Strode in Halloween 2018, where she's barricaded herself, much like Clear Rivers did in the second film, only instead of in a padded room like she did, she's built like her own little fortress in the middle of nowhere. And while it's a cool visual for the movie, that thing is a fucking death trap. Like, you look at it and you're like, how exactly is this the safest place in the world to be? It feels like you would die every 5 seconds trying to hang out in this place, even if death wasn't after you. I also don't feel like the lead character is one of the strongest. I think the family overall is an interesting group of characters, but our lead is one of the least interesting members of this family. And part of it might just be the way that she's written. She's kind of just there to be the one who's seemingly crazy, and all the other characters get a little bit more opportunity to have personality shine. It's weird. It's almost like she's a side character in the movie, even though she's clearly the lead. It feels like she's playing secondary to a much more interesting character, and it's got a weird dynamic to it. So I don't think she's terrible, and this franchise certainly is not plentiful with charismatic leads, save for maybe 2 of them. But I don't think she's one of the strongest. But my biggest issue and disappointment with Final Destination Bloodlines is that I think it has an incredibly weak third act. Now, that is something that I have said for all but one film in this franchise. That's Final Destination 5. All of these films, except for that one, slip a little bit or a lot of bit in the third act. Again, some worse than others. But this one, I think, has one of the weakest third acts in the entire franchise. And one of the biggest problems with it is that it feels like it's this fucking big. It's like a 5-minute third act. As soon as you know you're in the third act and the climax of the film, the credits roll like 2 minutes later. So I thought that was really weird the way that they paced that out. I don't know if there was reshoots or what happened there. And then just narratively what we go through, it feels like the least exciting part of this film. Like, you should be building to some of your best deaths or your biggest set piece or something along that lines, and it kind of works backwards, where in the third act it's the most small scale, and the only kill that you get is very quick and sudden and in the dark, and so it doesn't even really have like a real pop appeal there for those of us that are here for the carnage. And everything that's going on narratively feels incredibly reminiscent of a third act of one of the previous films that I'm not going to say specifically or I'll spoil it. So I really felt like the film, doesn't fall off a cliff or anything like that, but my level of interest and excitement and fun that I was having dropped significantly in the last 10 minutes or so of the film. When the credits rolled, I was like, oh man, damn, again. I don't know what it is about Final Destination movies where they have such a hard time trying to figure out how to end the film with excitement or end the film with a way that maintains our level of interest. They just always seem to fumble with that, and this movie is unfortunately of no exception. Overall, guys, despite definitely having a few issues that you would expect and maybe even a few that you would hope they would be past at this point, I had a really good time with Final Destination Bloodlines. I think it's easily one of the strongest sequels. I think it's a hell of a return for the franchise, and I'm very excited that it's succeeding so much, because that means we're going to get more that are hopefully on this level or even better. So if you love this franchise and you've been waiting for a Final Destination movie to get you back into those feels of the original films, I think this one does a really good job at that, and you'll likely enjoy it. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, click over here for all of my 2025 new release reviews. I'm also going to put a playlist up here of all of my Final Destination reviews, and coming in the next week or so, I'm going to have a ranking of all the films, a ranking of the premonitions, and a ranking of all of the kills, all the deaths in this franchise in a tier list. So definitely subscribe so you don't miss any of that. Like and share this video if you enjoyed it. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.